So this report, it's important to point out, is based on information from 2022, and before that, it isn't a direct response to Bezalel Smotrich, the current finance minister, and the new government, so to speak, around 9 months old. Nonetheless, it's speaking to a very sensitive issue in the country right now, the budget allocation to religious institutions and yeshivas. Your reaction to what we just heard out of that report?
So first of all, it is also true that the current coalition did commit to provide more public funds for religious institutions and students in yeshiva and Talmudic academies. Unlike the previous government that had decided to cut down on some of those subsidies to create incentives to go to work. So even though, as you mentioned, the OECD report also covers previous years, the tendency under the current Israeli government is in fact to increase those subsidies. And this goes, it's mostly because of political calculation, because when Benjamin Netanyahu was finance minister between 2003 and 2005, he in fact cut down on the subsidies to create incentives for the ultra-Orthodox to go to work, and it worked. But, you know, he's basically in this, with his current economic policy, going against his own economic ideology because of his political calculation and his need to preserve his coalition with the ultra-Orthodox.
Is Israel incumbent? Does it need to be responding to this report?
We are a member of the OECD, thankfully, and part of the job of this organization is to point out to its members when they're doing well and when they're not doing well, when they could and should rethink their economic policy. Obviously, these are just recommendations, and being a member of the OECD does not mean that the organization, of course, can give instructions to its members, but it is an objective, it has its objective data and analysis, and can point out to its members when they're not performing properly. By the way, among the criticism of the OECD, you mentioned a few of them, but there's also the fact that Israel is very much behind the rest of the OECD members on climate change. Sure. And that even though we are the startup nation and we have a lot of technologies that could be very helpful for energy transition, Israel is very much behind. And I think that you know, we should take advantage of the fact that we're a member of the OECD and we're being told where we're not actually performing, and take this into account for our own sake.
Some might argue, though, that internal issues and internal decisions remain something that need to happen inside the country, but for sure your point is taken in terms of the global concerns. Very briefly, the concerns around the country having a dual-track situation on the economy in terms of high-tech flying away, a global leader, and other industries perhaps lagging behind. Is that a worry right now in 2023? It
is, but it's not new. There's been for many years a gap between a thriving high-tech industry and middle classes in Israel that do not work in the high-tech industry and find it very difficult to make ends meet because the cost of living is very high in Israel. And again, if you compare the Israeli figures to the OECD, the cost of living is very high in Israel, and comparatively, the income is not as high as in the rest of the OECD in terms of average. So this is something that's not new. And again, I think that Israel should definitely listen to the OECD for its own sake.
Certainly many challenges ahead on the economic front. We always appreciate your insight. International relations expert, Dr. Emmanuel Navon.